Welcome to the latest edition of our Inspire series of interviews. For Andy Halliday, the opportunity to manage the Great Britain men's hockey team at the London 2012 Olympics was perhaps the pinnacle of an enthralling journey. He has enjoyed a career spanning 3 decades, policing London and balancing the demands of international sport. Andy was a Metropolitan Police officer for 30 years before retiring in 2010, and he spent the majority of those years as a specialist firearms officer. He participated in nearly 3,000 firearms operations with his unit CO19. He developed his skills in the pressured environment of the 1980s, worked fearlessly during the rise of gun crime, and then had to deal with the advent and threat of global terrorism, which was to come to the streets of London in July 2005. Having left the police in 2010, he took on the role of team manager of the England and Great Britain men's hockey teams, a role in which he continues to this day. Alongside this, he is now working with Clear Track Performance as a human factors and leadership coach. In his spare time, he claims to have invented extreme hockey dribbling, and his dribbling challenges have raised thousands of pounds for charity. He is a fervent and passionate supporter of our armed forces and is an ambassador for Hockey for Heroes. He is also a mentor on the Pathfinder scheme at Help for Heroes, an ambassador for Access Sport and Disability Hockey, and is incredibly proud of the work that he has done with an Olympic legacy hockey project for disadvantaged youngsters in Newham. Thank you for taking the time to join us today, Andy. Andy, nice to see you again, and I suppose that ordinarily you would have been making final preparations with the Great Britain men's hockey squad for the Tokyo Olympic Games next month.
Yes, we would have been. We've actually just had to put everything back a year, which I know sounds, I suppose it's as easy as that. It's not as easy as that, as I'm sure people will understand that I think the uncertainty, particularly during the early weeks of lockdown and COVID, around whether the Olympic Games were going to go ahead or not. I think people realised they probably weren't going to go ahead. I mean, it just would be impossible. But I think the International Olympic Commission were very keen to make a decision as late as possible. So, yeah, and it's an interesting one because it's I think a little bit of stoicism over the years. I guess being a bit stoic, being an ex-copper, I think it's been quite easy for me to cope with these things. I think the athletes may have struggled a bit more, but you know, we're looking forward. Don't get me wrong, that we are really looking forward to. Hopefully, they'll go ahead next year.
Good. And let me just take you back in time, if I can, to start with. Back to your school days. Can you tell me what sort of character you were at school and what you were like at school, maybe?
I'll be honest, Nick. I'm not sure that I was the greatest scholar. I was big into my sport. I absolutely love my sport. And, you know, we're talking 1970s, late 70s, when actually you couldn't get qualifications in sport. So the old O-level, A-level system that we used to have revolved around geography, English, maths, you know, all the sort of mainstream subjects and the sciences. I love my sport. So what I found was that I ended up probably neglecting some school subjects because I was just so keen on playing lots of different sports. So funnily enough, I ended up leaving what was effectively what used to be known as the lower sixth form. And I left a little bit early without having taken A-levels. I wanted to be a PE teacher. That was always my sort of burning ambition, but my qualifications weren't good enough to get me to university at that point. And that was purely because I was, you know, I wanted to play cricket, I wanted to play rugby, I wanted to play hockey, I wanted to play football. And of course, you couldn't get any qualifications. So I don't look back on, I mean, I guess I didn't achieve as much as probably I could have done and should have done. Okay,
very honest. And I suppose you've mentioned your interest in sports there. There were probably teachers who inspired you maybe on the route that you've ultimately taken in terms of sports at schools. You have fond memories of those people and those people who steered you in those early years.
I do, and you know, my strong memories, as you've mentioned, are of my sort of PE teachers around that time, who I always remember looking up to and being very respectful of all that they'd achieved. But it's interesting, because I think if you talk to people nowadays, they PE teachers, I think, are a bit like Marmite. You either come away from a school education thinking they were fantastic and they did so much for you, or if you're not particularly sports inclined, probably it sort of sits at the other end, and people talk about sports teachers as really being memories maybe that people want to forget. But for me, there was a guy called Alan Woodland. He was an ex-rugby player from the northeast, had a real influence not just on my sport, but also I just thought everything, the way he conducted himself, the way he spoke to people, he had a big impression on me throughout my school career at St Albans Grammar School.
Okay, so wanted to be a PE teacher. It wasn't going to happen, unfortunately. So why the police, and how did you get into the police in the first place?
Well, again, this is quite I guess an odd story. I ended up leaving the lower sixth, and I started doing a milk round. Would you believe? Electric milk float, glass bottles. I know things have turned full circle now. I think there are, we have electric milk floats and glass bottles again. But this was, as I say, back in 1978, 1979. So I started doing a milk round, and I heard an advert on Capital Radio, and they basically said, look, do you want to play as much sport as you like and earn £22 a week? If you do, join the Metropolitan Police Cadets. So I thought, well, that sounds like me. But it obviously meant I was going to have to leave home, which at 17 was always going to be a little bit of a challenge for me. But I signed up literally heard that advert on Capital Radio, and within a couple of weeks I'd signed up and embarked on, the most fantastic career.
And what were those early years like? Did you find it challenging to start with, or did you feel that you were to the manner born? It was something that suited you and your characteristics and your personality?
I love the sport, funnily enough.
Yeah.
I found it challenging. I think throwing in those days, I think I was young. My background was, I was very lucky, very strong family setup, decent schooling, middle class, home counties. So I guess I'd had a really supportive background. Being thrown into then some of the areas of London where I ended up working in Brixton and in Tottenham, and it was a real eye-opener. And as a youngster, those were the days where policemen and police women were still, they were out on the beat. So you went out and learned beats. So it's a real eye-opener. I think it did a great deal to develop my character. And I think the thing about being a police officer is it's almost like it's a painful privilege in some ways, in that it's a fantastic job, but you get to witness the very best and the very worst. And in those days, 1970s, 1980s, ironically, early 1980s, at 1981, the first serious rioting that I think we'd seen for some years on the mainland, in Brixton, in South London, and then it spread to the rest of London. So it was, being involved in that was something that I guess, you can't walk away from that. You're there and you cope with it and you deal with it. So it was a tough upbringing. Yeah.
And what led you then to, take the decision to train as a specialist firearms officer?
I think again, my sport followed me throughout my police career, and I initially got very interested in becoming a riot training instructor. Now, the riot training instructors generally were policemen who were also sportsmen and sportswomen. So I was quite lucky in many ways in that I got involved and became a riot training instructor. So I was able to carry on with my sport, keep myself fit, play my sport, play a little bit of sort of representative police hockey, and almost a natural move from being part of the public order training unit across to the firearms unit. And there was a general interest, I think, that there was common ground with the traits that you needed to be either a specialist firearms officer or an firearms instructor or a physical training instructor, riot training instructor. So there's a lot of common ground there. So I guess it just naturally, I wasn't one for promotion. I'd set my stall out. I really wanted to enjoy the experience that I had with the job, and promotion wasn't the thing that really sort of floated my boat. It was really all about becoming a specialist in different departments. So a natural gravitation, I think, from one to the other.
Okay, and you mentioned some of the common traits there. Could you maybe just expand on that a little bit and some of the key skills that you think you had to have within the roles that you undertook?
Yeah, I think the first one really is around mindset, and I'd use this advice to anybody setting out today, looking ahead. It's really, you'll hear the phrase growth mindset used, but you've actually got to think ahead, think development, and that involves when you get criticism or you get feedback probably that you don't like. How you cope with that is really, really important. And I think one of the things that I guess I feel I've always had is this ability to accept criticism, feedback. And when we look back to the 1980s, 1990s, feedback probably wasn't given as calmly, let's say, as it is these days. So those days, you take quite a few hits, mental hits, where being able to just see the developmental side of that and not take it personally, I guess that was a trait that I developed. That actually always looking at the bigger picture and wanting to grow. And I guess now, I sit here, I'm 58. I'm still working pretty hard and I'm still growing. I'm still developing my skills. So I think it's having an open and growth mindset is a really positive trait to take. You're going to get ups and downs, but you have to accept those and move on.
And of course, that's something that's become very prevalent in education, the idea of a growth mindset and developing that level of resilience. And I'm sure we'll touch on that a little further in a moment. But there must have been difficult times as well, Andy. I'm thinking in particular maybe around the terrorist atrocities of July 2005 in terms of what you were dealing with, the things that you were seeing. Can you give us a little bit more information about those sorts of times, please?
Yeah, I think throughout your police career, it's very uneven what you experience. So you experience some very positive, good things, good results, pitching up and going to some suspects on premises at a golf club, and you end up making 5 arrests and people are charged with burglary, and it's really good result. But at the other end, being exposed to, you obviously see a few dead bodies, you go to a few sudden deaths, and probably the worst thing I think is delivering death messages, which of course currently is something that's very poignant and in the news with COVID. So throughout your career, it's almost as if you develop this sort of mental layer of body armor that gets thicker and thicker as you go. Coming to the times around 2005, I think probably post 9/11. So when These airliners were flown, aircraft were flown into the World Trade Center. I mean, I think that was a major event for everybody that just showed that terrorism had really moved. We now had suicide terrorism. We'd been brought up very much with the IRA, who were, if you like, respectful terrorists. I know that sounds awful, but when they were in the UK, you know, if you confronted them, generally they gave up. You know, they put their hands up, and for us as firearms officers. But then it all changed. So 2001, everything changed, which meant that the dealing with suicide terrorism, I think, was something that we knew it was going to happen, but we weren't quite sure when. And to be honest, we discussed tactics and we practiced all sorts of different things. But when that day, 7/7, when that happened, I think it took us all by surprise that we actually had suicide terrorism on the streets of London. And from then on, you know, that few weeks afterwards, we were working long hours, you know, 18, 19-hour days with a few hours kip on the floor in a police station, and then back to work the following day. And it really challenged us throughout that period. And I think, you know, being exposed to those sorts of atrocities was something that over the years you develop, and you as I say, you develop this sort of this Kevlar, this mental Kevlar, these different layers that allow you to be exposed to that sort of thing, but actually cope with it, and, you know, come back to work the following day and move on. And that's a skill, I guess, that I've sort of developed over the years. But probably if I look at that period, it was the most challenging, certainly.
Right. And you've also worked as a firearms instructor. And I just wonder, you've talked about some of the qualities and skills that you need in that sort of role. What strategies did you use maybe as an instructor to try and enable your charges, those you were teaching, to make decisions under extreme duress?
Again, decision making under pressure is something that over the years, I think you have to practice it. I don't think it's something that you can just look at a book, read a few guidelines, and then make the right decision. I think that you have to be very much so. Mental skills and development of mental skills, I think, is really important, and we see it with our athletes, and certainly over the years as a specialist firearms officer and instructor, you see it with your officers. I guess my experiences were police officers make subjective decisions all the time, so they deal with different incidents on a day-to-day basis, and you are always decision making. And that's based on your sort of knowledge of the law, and that's sort of set in stone in some ways. But these subjective decisions are based on discretion. So, you know, I didn't always make the right decisions. I knew that, but it's almost as if you gather this in a way they call it thin slicing. So sometimes you get to a point where you make a decision and you make the right decision, but you're not quite sure why you've made the right decision, and it's based on years and years of experience. So I think general policing, dealing with conflict on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis, helps you develop this decision-making ability. And then the more you're exposed to firearms situations, because quite frankly, I think as a firearms officer, you develop these skills as a police officer, which give you a really good base. The ability to communicate, the ability to make good decisions under pressure. But then what they do is they add this pistol. So they give you a gun and they add that. So what you're doing is you are adding. You've already got this really good set of rules, values, norms that you use, experiences to make these decisions. Then they add this gun, which just ramps things up a little bit. And then so you're using all your experiences already, and then on top of your basic police experience, you've then got these effectively don't shoot type scenarios that you get, where you've got to make a decision very, very quickly. So I think developing your mental skills to be able to cope with those situations. So understanding thinking fast and slow. And there's some brilliant books out there that you can read about these things. So that, the chimp paradox, which is one, Steve Peters, which I think people may have heard of. But there are others out there. And I think accepting that 95% of the time we make instinctive decisions on a day-to-day basis. Sometimes that 5% where we are slower decision-making, logical decision-making, you've actually got to sort of step away from that instinctive mode that you're in. And although it's 5 times slower making that rational decision, it's actually really easy to just step back. So a great example for me was every time I used to unload a pistol or unload a gun at the end of the day, because I did that day in, day out, it would be very easy to just do it instinctively. And that's actually when accidents can happen. So I would always, whenever I unloaded my gun in the unloading bay at the end of the day, I would stop and just think and go through the process in a logical way, step after step, which actually stopped me having any accidents. So I think just appreciating that our life is full of instinctive decisions, stepping back, just being a bit more logical about the way that you make decisions, and that actually really helps. Generally, I say, touch wood, I felt I made the correct decision. Finger on the trigger. I can look back on a career where I've probably made life or death decisions on a regular basis. It's about the experience. It's about training, mental skills training, exactly the same in sport, so that you have got your best equipped to make that decision at that time.
Great, thank you. You mentioned patrolling the beat when you started in Brixton and places like that, and obviously you finished some 30 years later and retired from the force. How had policing changed during that time?
Very, very different. I think 1980s, 1990s policing, I think the Met have come a long way over the years. I think policing has changed. I think when I began, I don't think there was necessarily a great deal of policing by consent. I think it was, this is the way we will police London, like it or lump it. And then gradually, I think things have changed. Political correctness, things were very, very different when I left the job. And I would say this: I think probably in the 1980s, 1990s, there were things that happened that, I look back on. I wouldn't necessarily be proud of some of the habits, maybe some of the values and some of the traits that the police had in those days. But I guess they were sort of socially acceptable in some ways, and so. We as we all know, particularly at the moment, things have changed incredibly over the years. And although the events in America over the last few weeks have just been awful, and the way that the American police have dealt with some of the individuals that they've some of the incidents they've been called to deal with, really, when I think back over the years to how things have changed, it's almost as if we haven't moved at all when you see some of the scenes of some of the things that have happened over there. I think over here in the Met, I think we've probably, certainly around decision making, training for police officers, I think there is much more attention to a more sort of in-depth training around how you deal with conflict, would be my experience. I think our police service are better trained to deal with those sorts of incidents. But of course, 99%, you're always going to get the odd bad apple. You're always going to get 1% in there who don't necessarily follow guidelines or maybe become police officers for the wrong reasons. That will always be there. I think it's there in many occupations. But overall, policing has changed incredibly since I began, back in 1980.
Yeah. And as a former police officer, how do you feel when you see some of the footage from this country, our capital city, and other cities in the UK? In some cases, the police being under attack from members of the public. How does that make you feel as a former officer yourself?
I actually get to a point where I have to switch the news off. I think there's only so much you can take, and I think probably for everybody, police officer or not, I think for everybody, the last 3 or 4 months have probably been very, very difficult. And I think it's very easy to expose yourself to too much social media, to too much news coverage. So part of my sort of stoicism, if you like, is that I will ration myself to 20 minutes of the news, maybe in the morning or the evening, so that I just don't get news all day, because it is so emotive and obviously very, very political. I think the scenes that we've witnessed around the world have been incredibly upsetting, and I think on the back of, obviously, we had the Brexit up till Christmas, we've now had COVID, we've now got these terrible scenes that we're seeing. I think it would be very easy to just become very cognitively affected by what you see, and become very biased if you watch too much of this coverage. So for me, it's actually about just have a look at cover the news, have a look at 15 or 20 minutes, but then just take a little bit of a step back. I really feel for police officers these days. I think they're doing a very, very difficult job, particularly in London, as we saw last weekend and we've seen the last few weeks. I think times probably the job was a little bit easier when I was in it than it is at the moment.
Yeah, and when you reflect on your career and you look at policing now, is it something that you would recommend to a young person as a potential career?
I think it's a fantastic career. I think the opportunity, I guess, that presents itself when you join the police service, when you think about how many different areas there are that you can explore, and how many ways you can specialize. So, for my route was as a riot training instructor, and then joining the specialist, becoming a specialist firearms officer. For others, criminal investigation, so going down the CID route. There is the opportunity to do bodyguard work. There is the opportunity to become a public order specialist, to become a mounted branch specialist. There are so many different areas where you can utilize a different skill set. And of course, there's promotion. That's the other thing. If you're ambitious, then you can join and seek promotion and try and get as high as you can within the police service. So I think despite the impression at the moment that it is very tough being a police officer, I think the options that you have by joining, I would say great career and a great opportunity.
Okay, let's move on to hockey then. You've mentioned that real passion for sports when you were at school. Can you maybe tell me a little bit more about yourself as a player, what position you played, what you enjoyed about the game, why it grabbed you in the way that it did?
I think, first of all, my dad played. I as a young 4 or 5 year old, I used to follow my dad on a Saturday afternoon. He was a goalkeeper. He played in goal for a club called Harpenden, who were they still have a club. They play, I think, in one of the lower East leagues. I used to go and sort of stand behind his goal with a stick and a ball. I mean, remember it was one of his old sticks, and he just sort of chopped the top of the handle off. So I had this short stick, and that's how I sort of began playing hockey. And as I've said, I'm big into my sport. And then at about 9, the first club, Colts as it was known then, system was developed, and there were a few clubs, Harpenden, I think Woking, Staines, Eastcote. There were a few different clubs who had a Colt section. Now, of course, we see it countrywide. So So I began as a youngster and really sort of grew up in hockey, but loved playing other sports. So it was my dad really who was responsible for getting me into the game. And then I was lucky. I played at England under-21s, and then got involved with the senior squads. But it was a bit of a balance between a police career that I was really enjoying, and I wanted to get on in my police career, balancing that with a sports career and a hockey career. So I probably I didn't fulfill my expectations, because I think unlike nowadays, you can't really become a full-time hockey player. In those days, it was really about balancing. We used to call us weekend warriors. So we'd do our Monday to Friday job, and then the international squads would get together at weekends. And it was the beginning of AstroTurf. So the 1980s, AstroTurf hockey was shifting from grass to AstroTurf. So I guess as a player, I was never the most talented. I had to work pretty hard at my game. I wasn't one of these brilliantly quick, great hand-eye coordination. I was part of the engine room, I guess you'd sort of describe it. Worked very hard in the midfield. As an international player, generally as a defender, and throughout my indoor career as a defender as well. So it's interesting, because now when I reflect on some of my habits that I had as a younger player, it was sort of do as I say, not as I do, a little bit, because I wouldn't say my disciplinary record as a player was brilliant. But I think that probably went hand in hand with being a police officer, in that I was sort of working hard during the week, lots of shifts, and almost as if my hockey was my I sort of let off steam on a hockey pitch at the weekend. So it's interesting when I talk to people, and there aren't that many people around that remember me as a player now, but I'm often reminded when I'm talking to umpires about how I want players to conduct themselves. I'm often reminded of my past, let's say.
Okay. And is coaching and management, was that something you aspired to, or was that something that was thrust upon you really because you were an international player and you were maybe expected to take a role, once you came to the later stages of your playing career?
It was quite odd, really. I became totally immersed in my police work. So during my 30s, sort of into my 40s, it became very 24/7, and I had to take a little bit of a step away from hockey. So I stopped playing at 40, partly because we'd gone through the advent of AstroTurf, really very hard pitches, and my joints were starting to ache at 40. And I'm sort of thinking, if I carry on, by the time I'm 50, I'm going to have a couple of new hips. So I actually had to take a step back from playing at that point. And I was so involved in my police career that actually I did nothing in hockey for a few years. I just stepped away from it. And then I suddenly realized, funnily enough, the events of around that period we spoke about in 2005, a lot sort of changed in my life. I was involved in an incident where an innocent man who was believed to be a suicide terrorist was fatally wounded on a tube train. It was my team who were involved with that, and I wasn't the one that pulled the trigger. It was my team, and I was on that team, and I think that had quite an adverse effect on me. And it was almost, when I reflect on that whole situation and what sort of led up to it, I guess I needed hockey again, and I'd been out of hockey for some years. So I contacted the then performance director at England Hockey, David Faulkner, and said, look, what are there any opportunities to maybe develop some of the younger players, and either in a coach or a managerial role. And I then ended up applying to work with the under-21s, thinking that I would bring my police career and my hockey career together in that either managerial or coaching role. So I've always viewed sport not just about coaching. I think it's about developing personalities. It's about developing people to make them better individuals, not just better hockey players. So I guess the role for me, the hand really fit the glove very, very well. So I started working with the under-21 group, and then was lucky in that around 2009, 2010, the then manager of the England senior group decided to take a step back. So I stepped into that role, which I've done since. But I've coached the national indoor team, and I've been coaching my club at St Albans as well. So it's been a balance between, I guess, managing and coaching, and the ability to use everything you've experienced throughout your career, as I say, to develop individuals as people rather than just hockey players. And great. I mean, it naturally happened, really.
Yeah, and you've mentioned a few times already, you see that there are clear parallels between your career within the police and your career within sport, and there's a lot of crossover between the two.
Yes, there is. I think that there are. I mean, we've mentioned the growth mindset already. I think that's something, whether you're a sports person, whether you're somebody who wants to grow as a police officer and develop, or whether you just want to grow as an individual, I think having the right mindset is important. I think the other thing, to me, when I now look back on my career, is the ability to be stoic and understand that there are many things you can't control in your life, not to lose energy, not to become disheartened about things that happen that you can't control. So I think that applies as an athlete, that applies as a police officer. So I always talk about having this circle around you that you can control. So these are the things. So we can always control. For example, we can always control how we react to something. We might not be able to control the outcome, but we can control how we react. So if you think a very simple analogy, maybe an umpiring decision on the pitch, you can't actually control what the umpire is going to do, whether he's going to blow his whistle, which way he's going to give the free hit or the penalty corner, but you can control how you react to it. And actually, I think that's really important. So that's one of the skills that I think I've brought from policing, from sport, from my sort of everyday life, is that we control what we can. Then if you look a little bit further, there's a slightly larger circle of things that maybe you can influence. So we might not be able to completely influence something, but we can influence it. So that's our next little circle. So we're aware of stuff we can control, stuff that maybe we can influence, and then you look further ahead and there's the stuff that's out of our control. Classic situation at the moment, the way that the government are reacting to COVID, we can't control that. So actually that sits outside our circle of influence, sits outside our circle of control. So I've, if you like, taught myself to think, I'm not going to lose energy or allow myself to get, emotionally drawn and involved in these situations.
And just tell me a little bit maybe about how your players, the GB players at the minute, they were preparing for possibly the pinnacle of their career next month. Some of them now might not make it to the squad next year, I suppose, is a possibility. There might be new young blood coming through. How are they dealing with the current situation around the lockdown and COVID and the disappointment of not going to an Olympic Games in a few weeks' time?
Well, I think initially it was, if you remember those early days when lockdown began, I think we all felt we needed to be doing something. So I think the athletes were the same. They sort of felt, okay, so what can I do? What can I keep? And we all realised, I think, after a couple of weeks that we probably needed to just take a little bit of a step back and accept, and again, going to this sort of stoicism, accept that probably for a few months, things are not going to be as they were. For the athletes, certainly some of them had signed contracts to go and play abroad next year. Others had already got jobs lined up post-Olympics. Some were going to retire, some were going to carry on. So there is automatically this real uncertainty and this ambiguity that lay ahead for them. And I think the support staff, for many of the support staff, it was probably the same. Some people were going to step away post-Olympics. So we have this real sort of big veil of uncertainty over us, I think. When the IOC turned around and said, right, it's going to happen next year at the same time, I think that was the best thing that could have happened, because everybody then completely reset their values. So for the athletes, they then had something to work to. So they could then make a decision around whether they were maybe going to cancel the contract to play abroad. Are they going to carry on? Are they? So I think having that certainty really helped. And of course, recently, our athletes, I mean, if you say they can't go onto an AstroTurf pitch, it's a bit like stopping somebody going into a sweet shop. They just want to go on there and play. So there's been a little bit of, the guidelines are frustrating. We can't get on the pitch. But we've had a very, very thorough return to training schedule has been written. So everybody knows exactly now where they stand and what's happening. I think it has been a difficult period. And I think the stoics amongst us have probably dealt better with it than those that maybe struggle a bit with that lack of control and not being able to control things. I think as far as the athletes are concerned, they're probably the only thing that's a little bit frustrating at the moment is seeing probably other countries around the world practicing again and training again. That's probably difficult. But when we sit now and say the Olympic Games are 13 months away, and actually what are we losing? 13 months is a long time. There is plenty of time to prepare. And I know for a fact that Danny Kerry as head coach, his thinking is that he's only been working with this group just over 2 years, not a full Olympic cycle. And the more time that he feels he can have with the group, the better it will be for us and for the group. I think the other difficult thing for the athletes is that this is effectively a 5-year Olympic cycle. And actually, it's a bit about mindset. So, let's forget that it's a 5-year cycle and just now concentrate on we have a year to get ourselves right for an Olympic Games. And if we can focus on that and not worry about what's happened and COVID and everything else, I think we'll be in good shape for next year. Good.
When you look back on your career in sport, back to when you were at school and participating in a range of activities, the success you've had as a player, as a coach, as a manager, is there one particular highlight that sticks out for you?
There are quite a few, Nick. I think the one real standout for me, I guess, is London 2012. And I learned so much about being part of a team, about my own individual approach to sport and to life. Really, it was obviously a once in a lifetime event, a home Olympics, and almost looking back on my police career, when I talk about the contrast in experiences that you dealt with, London had that over 2 weeks. So throughout this fantastic 2-week period, the Olympic Games, we saw the absolute joy of hosting an Olympic Games in this country, and in fact, I can feel the hair standing up on the back of my neck as I speak. We're hosting a Games, and this wave of enthusiasm started with a little bit of a trickle, but then once we got going, it was immense. And I think being in the Olympic Village and living in the Olympic Village throughout that period, you didn't appreciate what was going on outside. So that was one of the things. The other thing was that we were tipped, the men's team and the women's team. We were both an outside chance to win a medal. And I think when you look at home advantage, you think we could win a medal here. And I think we believed we could win a medal. And we ended up getting through the group stages and playing against Holland in a semi-final. There was so much that was going on throughout that period, almost as if your life is just squashed into 2 weeks. You know, meeting, having dinner with in a dining venue with athletes who you've looked up to for years and years, and sitting opposite Ryan Giggs and eating your breakfast, chatting with Chris Hoy about just things that an incredible experience. And then we ended up playing Holland in the semi-final, and we lost 9-2. And it was live on BBC television. And it was as if, I had to sort of pinch myself towards the end of that game thinking, I hope this is just a nightmare and I'm going to wake up. And of course you didn't. And then dealing with the aftermath of that and how athletes have prepared for Olympic Games 3.5 solid years, and it's come effectively to an abrupt end with that semi-final loss. But then thinking, well, we're going to play Australia for a bronze medal here. If we'd said at the beginning we're going to be playing for a medal, we probably would have taken that. But the experience of that semi-final, I think, and there just being effectively a 40-hour gap between the games, was probably one of the toughest times as a sports person. And we lost to Australia in that playoff and finished 4th, which is often considered the worst place to finish in Olympic Games. And then the following Monday evening, I was sitting at home. It was just the oddest period. And I think if I look back on it, if I were to prepare myself and think, what did I learn from that? It was, I guess, they call it pre-mortem, where you try and think about all the things that can happen ahead of you and try and rehearse that experience, and always look at the bigger picture. The bigger picture is in 2.5 weeks, 3 weeks time, you'll be back home with the family, and this memory will be strong in your mind, but it'll just gradually get less and less important as you go through your life. So I guess I've sort of gone a very roundabout way of answering that question, Nick, but the London 2012 Olympics will always be probably the most vivid sporting experience that I've had, for good reasons and bad reasons.
And I suppose then 4 years later, there were disappointments around the Rio Olympics. You've touched on the situation that transpired in 2005, and that was to impact your participation in the 2016 Olympic Games in Rio. Can you expand on that a little bit for us, please?
Yeah. So as I mentioned earlier, there was a believed suicide terrorist who, as a team, we followed into a tube station, and he was fatally wounded. It transpired later, 24 hours later, and without going into the circumstances of why shots were fired, and 24 hours later, we learned that an innocent Brazilian electrician had been fatally wounded, and very difficult to put those thoughts and feelings from that time into words. I mean, it was the toughest time I think we'd ever faced as a team. I was very proud of the fact I worked on a set of very experienced, very professional individuals. So that they were difficult times. We qualified for Rio. Now, obviously, the connection here is that the subject who was fatally wounded was Brazilian. The Olympic Games were in Rio 11 years later, and we qualified in 2015. And I didn't think that it was. I thought it prudent I should bring it up with the British Olympic Association, because I'd naturally had been involved in this incident and it was in the public domain. But sadly, it was. Politically, it was about safety of the team, and also about performance, whether this would be an unnecessary distraction for the team. And the decision was made that I should not go to Rio, which is very difficult, because if I think, and I talk about being stoic and If I think that 11 years later, I was rushing into that tube station where many people were rushing the other way, potentially thinking that I was going to face a suicide bomber. And then 11 years later, I'm not allowed to represent Team GB at an Olympic Games. It was a difficult one for me to take. I think, again, the bigger picture, taking a bit of a step back from that, seeing the bigger picture and actually focusing on 4 years' time was what really helped. So all the experiences I've spoken about that I guess I'd accrued throughout my career all contributed to this, all these layers of Kevlar, these mental layers of Kevlar that I've spoken about, this body armor that I created. And I was able to step back with the support of my family and the support of the GB group at the same time, and say, okay, fine, it's not going to happen for me. 4 years time, I still want to go to another Olympic Games. So 2016 was it was an interesting one because the team, the men's team who I would have been with, didn't even make the quarterfinals. I mean, it was a disaster as far as GB men were concerned. The women, of course, won gold. I was lucky in some ways in that I did a bit of work with 5 Live during that period, so I did some radio punditry. But the experience was quite surreal, not being there, them not doing very well, and then the women winning. Very, very strange. But I was, in the back of my mind, always going to be looking forward to 2020. And as it's now turned out, 2021.
And will you be heading to Tokyo with the squad next year?
Yeah, that's the plan. The long-term plan, funnily enough, was move up to Suffolk post Tokyo, the Suffolk coast, and that's actually happening fairly soon. Hopefully, we have always loved Suffolk, and I've always wanted to be sort of near the sea, and so that was the plan post Tokyo 2020. But then, of course, with the Olympics not happening, we've still trying to move up that way. But I've agreed that my current employer with Clear Track Performance has very kindly supported me, that I'm going to carry on working with the group and hopefully, fingers crossed, go to Tokyo next year, if it happens.
Well, you will have to come and visit us when you move to Suffolk. Come and see us in person again, of course.
I will.
Just the last few questions now, Andy. What advice would you give to young people who are ambitious about their sport? What would have been good advice for the young Andy Halliday when he was at school, do you think, about a career in sport? And of course, nowadays, as you've already mentioned, the opportunities for young people within sport are far greater, whether that's playing, coaching, management, support, whatever it might be. What advice would you give to that young person?
I think there'd be two little snippets of advice. The first one would be around the growth mindset, which we've spoken to, is that life, you will get ups and downs in life. If you always focus on what is it sort of immediately in front of you, sometimes it's very easy to lose that growth mindset, particularly when you might get some feedback that you deem to be negative, or you might struggle with a particular skill or struggle with a particular sport. So I think that growth mindset and seeing the bigger picture. So always look at the bigger picture. These are just hurdles that are there for us to get over. So look further ahead. The second one, I think, is it's not just about what you do on the sports pitch. It's about developing as an individual as well, and developing as a team, but developing as an individual. So there was a great bit of advice that I was given by a guy called Roger Self, who was the team manager of the 1988 GB men's Olympic gold medal winning team. And it was a simple bit of advice, and it was tidy on the pitch, tidy off it. So if you're tidy on the pitch, if you're good at hockey, if you're good on the pitch, be tidy off it. So that's everything that contributes towards being a sportsman or a sportswoman. It's about habits. It's about how you conduct yourself on a day-to-day basis, how you interact, how you communicate with other people. So for me, there's a bigger picture, and it's about how you develop as an individual. So the two little snippets, two little words of advice, really around seeing the bigger picture, but also making sure you develop as a person as well as developing on the pitch.
Great, thank you. We'll finish there, Andy. I'd just like to say again, thank you again for joining us for this latest in our Inspire series. It's always fascinating to listen to you talk and share your experiences. And as I say, when you move to Suffolk in the near future, please come and see us again in person.
I will come and see you. Thanks, Nick.
Thanks, Andy. Thanks for your time.